afternoon and welcome to the Science Center. Especially notable that it's such a beautiful day outside and you chose to come inside, so thank you so much. I'm really glad to have you here. My name is Catherine Paisley. I'm the interim CEO here at the Ontario Science Center, and I'm so pleased to be launching the first of the 2020 Great Conversations Speaker Series. Has anybody been to one of the great conversations that we've had before? A few of you. That's really great. That's great. Thank you. So those of you who have, you know, and others, the speaker series is an opportunity to explore new and emergent topics in the area of science, and it's designed to spark a bit of debate and discussion. Events like this are all part of our mission to inspire the human adventure of discovery. This year we have an exciting three-part series, and the first one is today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the sacred land that has been the site of human activity for tens of thousands of years. This land is the territory of several Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Bell Covenant, an agreement between several nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today we acknowledge that we are settlers living on this land, and as settlers we owe respect, restitution, and reconciliation to these systemically injured Indigenous communities in the territory more recently known as Canada. So this afternoon we'll be exploring part 1 of 3 of the Mind series, and this one is Science Meets Psychedelics. We'll be learning about an emerging area of research, the use of psychedelics as potential treatment options for conditions such as anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Our panelists will share their firsthand experiences from clinical settings and discuss what might be on the horizon in terms of therapeutic possibilities. And as I said, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions and join the conversation, as our moderator, Dan Riskin, wants to encourage this dialogue and discussion, as do we. So we have two other, as I said, this is the first of 3. We have 2 others. One is on April 4th, and the third is on May the 2nd. It's the first Saturday of each month. On April 4th, the talk will be on the mindfulness of better brain health. We'll have speakers from 2 innovative projects, one to reduce the stress for adults with autism and their caregivers, as well as Director X, who will talk about mindfulness to reduce violence in communities. On May the 2nd, the discussion will focus on neuroplasticity, the adaptive brain, and ask questions such as, what can we do to adapt and develop our brains? And are there limits to what can be done? This year's Great Conversations are held in collaboration with our knowledge partner, the Ontario Brain Institute. This is the second time we've partnered with the Brain Institute, and we're so pleased to have them on as our partner. This time we worked together in developing our newest exhibition, MindWorks, which is in the Great Hall just outside of the auditorium. Perhaps that you saw it already in your visit today, and if not, please make sure you go and experience it after this great conversation. The exhibition was designed, created, and fabricated right here at the Ontario Science Centre. I'm pleased now to introduce Tom Mickelson, President and Scientific Director of the Ontario Brain Institute. And thank you again for coming today. Tom?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Catherine. Appreciate it. The Ontario Brain Institute is just delighted to be knowledge partners together with the Ontario Science Centre for this exhibit and especially for this speaker series, so this is delightful. My name is Tom Mickelson. I'm the President and CEO over at OBI. We're a non-for-profit funded by the Ontario government to bridge the gap between research, commercialization, and care, and the idea is to bring the best science towards care for folks dealing with neurologic disorders, which are pervasive, and most folks will be aware of family members or other partners that they know are dealing with neurologic disease. What we try to do is engage the public in our mission, and we're trying to unravel the brain, and of course that speaks directly to our knowledge sponsorship here. We have this Mind series, which as you heard are a series of 3 talks, which is just a great crystallization of how science is going to inform the next generation of care. Tonight's talk focuses on drugs that are often or have been used recreationally, and as you know, there's a huge political past to this. But in the 1950s, there were actually hundreds and hundreds of clinical trials, hardcore clinical trials for psychological diseases and depression in particular. And the resurgence that's come in recent years has been not based on any kind of recreational use, but things like dealing with patients with cancer who have this real existential issue about dealing with their ultimate demise, and the dramatic impact of psychedelics in that experience to the net benefit of quality of life. I'm not sure if you will have come across Michael Pollan's book called How to Change Your Mind, which is basically a lay experience about both the science, the culture, and the actual experience of going through the psychedelic experience. So I'm very, very excited to hear from the experts that we have today. This event, by the way, is going to obviously have photographs, as you just saw, and videography. And a video of the talks are going to be made available on the website in case you want to revisit any of it or pass on to other folks. So we encourage you to share it with others and stay tuned through the future events as well. If you can be here on site, terrific. If not, you can see it electronically. We also have new announcements of further talks on our website, which is on braininstitute.ca. So now a quick introduction of our moderator. Each of these three talks will be moderated by Dan Riskin. He's a PhD, a scientist, author, and TV personality. On TV, he's best known as the CTV Science and Technology Specialist and the former co-host of Discovery's Daily Planet. He's published multiple scientific papers, mostly in biomechanics in bats. I'm not sure we're going to have time to get into that today. Interesting story is that he actually has led a number of wildlife tours around the world, to Panama, Peru, and Borneo, nominally for telling folks that they're there to see birds, but invariably this involves bats. His first popular book, called Mother Nature is Trying to Kill You, was a Canadian bestseller. Anyway, once again, thanks for taking the time on a nice Saturday afternoon to be here. I'm sure it'll be worth your while, and I'd like to invite Dan to stage to take care of the program. Thanks very much.
Okay, hi everybody. Welcome. This should be fun. I'm very excited about this, and it's supposed to be a conversation. So the way I'm going to do this is a little non-traditional. Typically, what'll happen is they come out, I get to have a conversation, and at the end we say, do you have any questions? And you get to try to answer the questions that you've had burning in your head the whole time. Thank you very much for letting me ask. So what we're going to do this time is a little different. What we're going to do is I have sort of a direction I think this is going to go, and I'm going to try to push it in that direction, but I'm going to keep coming to the audience and saying, does anybody have a question at this point? And then if you put up your hand, someone will come down with a microphone and hold the microphone in front of your face, and you can ask your question. This is also being live streamed on the website of the Ontario Brain Institute, and so people can watch it there. And people can ask questions through Twitter, at Ontario Brain. You just send a message to @OntarioBrain. And you can ask your question that way. So that's how we're going to get things rolling, and I want it to start as soon as possible, so I'm going to introduce our speakers. The first is Anne Wagner, PhD, C Psychology. She's a clinical psychologist. She's an adjunct professor at Ryerson University, and she's the founder of Remedy, a counseling and research center in Toronto where, among other things, Anne focuses on the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, through cognitive behavioral therapy and psychedelics. Anne Wagner. And our other speaker is Norman Farb, PhD, Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, Director of the Psychedelic Studies Research Program. And in his research, Norm explores the neuroscience of human identity and the neuroscience of human emotions. And Norm's research includes questions that center on the use of psychedelics, specifically microdosing. Norman Farb. All right. And we're sort of between two lilies, which I kind of like, because it's sort of an homage to a show I like a lot. So, Norm, I'm going to start with you just to get some definitions out of the way. First of all, do you want a water?
I'm okay, thanks.
Okay. If you want a water, let me know. We have water right here.
Okay.
Do you want a water?
I have one, thank you.
Oh, you have one?
I do,
Okay,
already,
good.
yeah.
I've got a little cold tea. Okay, so Norm, my first question for you is, what is a psychedelic, and what makes a psychedelic different from other narcotics?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a psychedelic is supposed to create change in sort of core part of your experience. It's supposed to change the way that you actually relate to your experience in a way that other drugs perhaps target particular systems, like a physiological system, like a stimulant, and make you more aroused, or a tranquilizer, sort of turn things down. The psychedelic is actually supposed to get at the heart of how you're perceiving and relating to the world and restructure it in some way.
Okay, so it's not just sort of turning up the volume or turning down the volume, it's changing the channel a little bit.
Yeah, I would think more connection instead of activation, deactivation.
Okay, great. And how are people using psychedelics? Like, what is the range of uses that people use them for?
So when we're talking about using psychedelics, and particularly in a treatment or a clinical context, that's really different than when people are using them recreationally. So oftentimes when we've heard of psychedelics, and as we heard in the intro, that psychedelics have been used for, honestly, it's been thousands of years, if not millennia, in different contexts. But what we're seeing using them now is we see this resurgence of use within treatment, and particularly treatment for mental health conditions. So when we're using them within treatment, it's combined with a psychotherapy. So it's not this idea of people are going home and taking a psychedelic or using it many times. Rather, it's 2, maybe 3 times within a course of treatment.
Okay, so, and I'm just going to deep dive with you for a second to just get an idea of how your research works. So you're using MDMA, which is ecstasy, or Molly, is that also what it's called?
Yeah, so MDMA, or 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, if we want to go for
That's
the
what I
full
normally
name,
call
right?
it, but
Okay.
sure, we can use MDMA for now.
Sounds good. Yeah. So MDMA is the active ingredient in the drug ecstasy. Ecstasy, though, if anyone's heard of that one before, is usually cut with many other things.
Oh.
So if people are taking ecstasy, they may or may not actually be taking MDMA.
So it might not even be in ecstasy.
That's right.
Wow, okay, but it usually is.
Yeah, that's
All right.
the assumption is that would be the thing that is having
That
the
is the whole
psychoactive
thing
effect.
about buying things illegally and worrying about what exactly is in it. But that's a
Exactly.
whole other, we're not going there.
Different topic,
So how did
yeah.
you use MDMA in your research?
Yeah, so we use MDMA as an adjunct to psychotherapy. So that means that I'm involved in 2 different studies right now. One we just finished, and one we're this close to getting ethics approval for, where we're using MDMA in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so what that means is we're using treatments that exist on their own. So one called cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy and one called cognitive processing therapy. And then we're adding MDMA to it. So what that means is we're doing 2 MDMA sessions that are embedded in a treatment. So the therapists, and there's 2 therapists in these studies, they're sitting with folks their entire trip, right? So we're actually sitting with folks while they're having that experience, and it's a therapeutic experience. So the setting, and context, which are terms that we would use in the therapeutic use of psychedelics, are very important as to the effects it's going to have.
Okay, and so what does MDMA do specifically, like not generally psychedelics, but what does MDMA do to a person's brain that
Yeah.
makes it useful for what you're trying to do?
So MDMA specifically acts on a whole host of different neurotransmitters and hormones. In particular, serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine are the main neurotransmitters it's reacting on, and then oxytocin is one of the main hormones.
That's like the love hormone, right?
It is the love hormone. So
Yeah.
oxytocin is what we produce when we're feeling in love. It's what moms and babies are feeling when they're breastfeeding. It's that sense that you have that you are starting to connect. And it's just oxytocin, but that can elevate it. So with MDMA, what we're seeing happen is people are having this really connected experience. And it's not just connectivity, there's also what's happening in the brain is that there's 2 areas of your brain that are really important when it comes to both MDMA and PTSD. So really they fit so well together that it's pretty incredible. It's like if you could design a medicine to be used for the treatment of PTSD, this probably would be it. So within PTSD, your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that right here, where it has to do with your decision making, your planning, all the things that we would do, then that gets quieter. And then your amygdala, so the area in the back of your brain, that's the fight, flight, freeze reaction, that gets activated. And that is busy all the time when you have PTSD. So it's like the alarm system's constantly on. And if you take MDMA, it's the opposite that happens. So your amygdala gets quieter and your prefrontal cortex is more active. And so you get an opportunity to sit in that for a little bit of the experience. And I've actually had one participant say, it feels like PTSD isn't here right now in that moment. But it's for that moment. And it's also, it doesn't get rid of it. I want to be really clear about that. This isn't some magic bullet that's going to make it all better. It gives you a template, a taste of what that's like, and then what you do with it afterwards in the therapy, that's the important part.
Okay, so, and Norm, I promise you're part of this conversation. I will get to you, but I just want to get like a clear picture of and how this works. So, now you're usually treating two people at the same time, right? So can you just walk me through, what that therapy looks like, why there are two people there, and what the goal is?
Yeah. So the study that we ran it was a couples treatment. And the reason why we would do a couples treatment is that PTSD doesn't just impact one person. It impacts everybody in that person's environment, their loved ones, people in their community. So the idea of bringing a loved one into treatment has a whole host of different reasons why it can be beneficial, but not only because the partner is usually suffering themselves because of what's been happening. So bringing that person into treatment with you means that you both get to understand what's happening and go through that journey together. And feasibly what that actually looks like. And I'm wondering, can I take my slides?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay?
There it is.
Oh, there it is. Perfect. So that means that they're going through the whole process together. So starting at preparation, and you'll see that everything has therapy in these slides, and I made that really clear. It's like preparation equals therapy. MDMA-assisted therapy session. Integration equals therapy. It is not just taking a drug, it is a drug to help therapy along. And both partners are involved in that whole process together. And so what that really looks like is that there are two people in these recliner chairs. This is the room where we did MDMA sessions. We ran this particular study in Charleston, South Carolina in a clinic. And they would go through those MDMA days together in those recliner chairs. And we'd be sitting there as the therapists, assisting them in that process. And they'd go back and forth between having time inside where they're reflective of their own experience, and then time outwardly talking to each other and talking to us as the therapists, where we'd be helping them through that.
Wow. And so they have a bunch of therapy sessions, and then they have this trip that they do with you, there's a team of you, so you're sort of trading off.
Yeah, there's always two people in the MDMA session.
Okay, and then there's therapy that follows up afterwards.
That's right.
And so do you have any sense of what the success rate of this is compared to not using MDMA for this kind of therapy?
Yeah, so it's we're really excited about the results we've seen so far. So in the study we ran with the couples, 5 of the 6 couples no longer had PTSD.
Wow.
And all of them had improved relationship satisfaction.
Really?
Yeah.
And what's the control, though? Like, what happens if you do an analogous treatment, but without the MDMA?
Yeah, so that study itself didn't have a control, but when we compare it to other studies we've done of the treatment where they didn't have MDMA, and these were randomized controlled trials, it's actually stronger results than we've seen without the MDMA. And granted, we need to do bigger studies to actually show this on a larger scale, but we're excited and hopeful that this could be a booster to the treatment that we already know works for a good chunk of people.
Cool. Thank you for all that. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to just ask people, if you have a question at this stage, put up your hand, and we'll send a mic down. So let's see where the mic lands. I'll let the microphone runners do the deciding. Here we go. So we've got a question over here. And please speak right into the microphone so that we can hear you and so that it also broadcasts through web.
Hey, my question is simple. Do you also give the MDMA to the spouse?
Oh, good question.
Yes, we do. And that's a really important piece of it, because during the whole treatment, it's actually the relationship that's the client. It's not the person with PTSD. And that's so important. Otherwise, it ends up feeling like the client has 3 therapists. Rather, it's the 2 people together who are in the therapy, and so it's important that they do all pieces of it together. That whole point of giving someone a drug in treatment, so we were actually the first clinical trial that gave a drug in a treatment to someone who didn't have a diagnosis of something, and we were really wondering if that would fly with regulatory, and it was okay because the risk-benefit is so high when you're talking about PTSD that the idea of actually improving someone's outcomes it was worth the risk.
But so why was it in South Carolina and not in Toronto?
So very pragmatically, it was in South Carolina because our colleagues were in South Carolina and they had run MDMA studies before. So we were able to use the processes they already had set up to be able to get this launched much more quickly than other studies have been. So our next study is going to be in Toronto.
Cool. All right, great. Maybe we'll take one more question from the audience before I ask Norm about his work. Yeah, here we go.
Yes. Sorry. So a large component of the cognitive aspect of a lot of various therapies is cultivating insight. And generally, I mean, my understanding is very limited, but generally speaking, with perceptual distortion from psychedelics and possible hallucinations, would that not act as somewhat of a barrier to developing, improving metacognition, basically, developing insight in the patient?
So you're saying that because it's an artificial sort of reality during the trip, are you worried that the insight might also be artificial?
Or more so that it's when you're not able to clearly distinguish reality from hallucination, it's harder to develop a self-awareness of what things your condition is producing, what thoughts, ideas, feelings your condition is producing, versus what is a proportional response to reality, right? That distinction is an important part of developing insight, right? And if reality becomes unstable, makes it hard to distinguish condition from reality.
Okay, thank you for your question.
Yeah. So MDMA, given that it's actually not a classic psychedelic, doesn't have hallucinogenic effect. So that's one key thing. But also, even if we were talking about using psilocybin or LSD in treatment, and actually I'm involved in a study that's going to be using psilocybin for PTSD at Johns Hopkins, that the whole purpose, actually, of having it in a therapeutic context is to have the therapist help you make sense of what has happened afterwards. So there often are things that are very confusing that have happened, or understandings that are reached going like, whoa, I have this insight, or I had this understanding of something that I've not had before. How do I bring that into my reality in my everyday? How do I work that into my understanding of my own experience? And that's the role of the therapist afterwards, is to help with that, and within any psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy.
Great. Okay, thank you. That's a great introduction to your work. And so, Norm, speaking of psilocybin, you work on a different drug, or you're interested in a different drug, and that is the one that is in magic mushrooms.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about how that all comes together for you?
Sure, yeah. So this was a labor of love by my graduate students, actually, who for some reason were really interested in psychedelics. We started looking at Reddit, really, like internet forums, talking about people who were self-administering psychedelics, and we realized that there's this growing movement of people who are now microdosing. So they want to improve their performance in some way, or change their mood, but they want to still be highly functional, and they want to be able to have this sort of sustained growth trajectory.
So what is microdosing? What does that mean?
Microdosing is taking roughly a tenth of an active dose, and the idea is that you won't actually have perceptual distortions in terms of like hallucinations or like full-blown delusions, but you'll shake things up a little bit. and of course it's open, you're purposely going into this kind of gray area with your brain where you're like, things are a bit more fluid or less predictable than usual, but I'm still kind of in control. And in this kind of internet survey research, we would see this subforum of Reddit devoted to the microdosing double in subscribership every year. So like 5,000 people, 10,000 people, 40,000 people, 120,000 people who are voluntarily, they're spending their free time just talking about this. And a lot of them are talking about it because they're doing it. And I thought, hey, this is something that's happening, right? There's, in a way that maybe it wasn't so prevalent in the 1960s, this idea of that I can be, a high-functioning professional and also dip a toe into this sort of psychotropic world with a lot of purported benefits. So we started getting more interested in that, to the point that we started publishing on the survey research, both cataloging high-frequency benefits and also drawbacks to these practices. And that sort of opened the door to donors coming forward and venture capitalists and negotiating all of that to the point now where we actually want to do some real research on microdosing. So the studies we're publishing might have over 1,000 people in it, but each of them are just reporting on their own individual experience. We say it's like, you have 1,000 case studies that have one person in each study. That's not really science, or we can't make inferences to the population because every single person who comes forward came forward because there was something for them.
Right.
In the drug experience, we don't really know what it would be like in the general population.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, people are doing this microdosing. You said this is already something that's happening.
Definitely.
And when we spoke on the phone before this, you said, it's not like they're doing this on a weekend and going out in the woods. They're going and working a forklift that day.
Yeah.
So
I mean, probably not a forklift because it skews towards higher income, but yeah.
Oh, it does, eh?
But
That's
they're yelling at the person driving the forklift.
All right, so they're looking over their construction site where they're building.
But yeah,
their new
they're
building.
driving to work. They're taking care of people. They're trying to live their best life. They're not taking a break. It's not like a retreat sort of format. Yeah.
So, what does psilocybin do to the brain specifically?
Yeah, so psilocybin and LSD as well are actually very similar to the types of antidepressants you might be prescribed. They're serotonergic primarily, so they're going to work on the serotonin system. But they just little tweaks of the molecular chemistry make them have really different properties. So whereas antidepressant, so you get prescribed like Prozac or something like that, builds up serotonin in your brain and gives you more of a sense of control, almost like a top-down control. Psychedelics like psilocybin tend to also use those same neural pathways to increase the sensory inputs to these control areas. So you actually feel more connected, but also maybe a bit more chaotic rather than feeling like you're more dominant over your thought processes.
So can you walk me through, I mean, so you're not at the stage yet where you're doing trials with this, right? But what does an experiment look like the way you're envisioning collecting data?
A microdosing trial? Yeah, so from the survey research, most people are doing these, taking these tenth of an active dose 2 or 3 times a week. I think to be practical, especially because we don't know how long the time course will last for people to be safe to be released and go drive, we're probably going to administer once a week over a several-week period and see if you get this slow buildup of insight or changes in mood or creativity or some of the other high-frequency benefits that are purported. But what we would like to do to make it a bit more scientific and provide some more evidence is have people cross over into placebo and have some sort of placebo where they feel like something's kind of going on, and there's lots of things you can do. You can take some powerful multivitamins and be like, ooh, something's happening. And then people won't know whether they start off on the drug or not. So if it's supposed to be not an acute high, but it's supposed to have this sort of like bottom-up percolation into insight and change, could you get that with the multivitamin? Because then we don't have to, change prohibition on these drugs. But if it turns out there's something that's beating placebo, maybe it's worth investing more in exploring and understanding, the boundaries, but also benefits around drug use.
So acknowledging that a bunch of people that report on a subreddit that they're having a good experience is not a scientific survey of the possible things that happen. Some people might have no experience and not write into to the Reddit. Mm-hmm. Some people might have a negative experience and not write into Reddit. But based on the scattered stuff that's out there, mm-hmm. What are some of the things that people are saying this is doing for them, and what are the things that people are saying is going wrong with it, or is there anything?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would also add we did look at people on the internet forums who are former users as well, so they at least have they've turned towards it and turned away from it. So we're trying to get as complete a picture as we can with those limitations you mentioned. So by far the number one benefit, which is like 25-30% people will talk about improved mood. So that's like the
improved mood.
Yeah, so that's like the head of the benefit chain, and then the 3 runners up are more stable attention, mm-hmm. More creativity, and sense of agency or self-efficacy. So like when you get up in the morning, like how many people go to bed and be like, tomorrow I'm going to do this thing, and then the day happens, like I didn't do the thing. Right. So they feel like they're able to get done what they want done a bit more, and that's on the benefit side. Now what's really interesting is the drawbacks often parallel the benefits just less frequently. So for every 2 people who might say my mood got better, someone will say I feel more anxious or my mood is like I'm having bigger mood swings. For each 2 people who say my attention is better, someone will say I feel really scattered or I get too locked into things and I'm missing things. For every person, well, I don't know if there's a negative corollary to creativity, but people will say
writer's block.
Yeah, but we haven't seen that show up as much. But pretty much most of the benefits have the kind of dark side that can happen too, and it's not clear at all why one person gets the benefit whereas someone else gets the drawback. But I think what Anne said is really well-known, established knowledge now that the context matters a huge amount.
Right.
So if you have a whole bunch of environmental stressors and you microdose a little, and now you've like become more open to taking in sensory information that could provide insight, but now what you're getting is just blasted by your work environment, your home environment. It's probably not going to suddenly sublimate into joy.
Yeah.
It's going to be more intense suffering. So
Okay.
I think we see both sides of the spectrum there.
Okay. And you prepared a couple slides as well. Do you want to maybe give
why
you a
not?
chance to look through
I was
them?
going to peruse through a really brief history. So even in prehistory, there's a lot of fossil evidence, sort of anthropological surveys showing that all throughout the world, there's evidence of different ancient cultures using psychedelics. A lot of it purportedly in sort of ritualistic, sort of rites of passage, shamanic rituals, but who knows? We really don't know. We just know that there's evidence of psychedelics in pretty much every continent other than Antarctica. So it seems like there really is this long-standing history. But the history that most people know is, the 1950s and 60s history, and a lot of that is pushed by like better life through chemistry, right? So you have this guy, Albert Hoffman, who's puttering around in a lab I think he's trying to create a stimulant, and he accidentally makes LSD. And he gets some on himself, and then he goes for a bike ride, and apparently it was a transformative bike ride, and within a few years, that company now is giving out free LSD for people to try in order to sort of like explore this new market. And one of the main places it goes is into clinical therapy research. So before like all of the hippy-dippy flower stuff in this mid to late 60s, you have people doing psychedelic-assisted pharmacotherapy, therapist-assisted pharmacotherapy or psychedelic-assisted talk therapy, depending on how you want to look at it, and getting really positive results, especially in the most treatment-resistant kind of cases. And what starts to become clear is in the hands of a competent therapist, these drugs tend to be skew very much more towards the benefits than drawbacks. But then, of course, you also get the person who like thinks they can fly and jump off the building, but guess they probably weren't in the middle of a therapy session when that happened, right? So you get both the popularity and the potential of these drugs, but also this fear of like, what is this doing, especially to our youth, right? And that turns into serious political issues when the U.S. starts going to war a lot in the late 60s, and you have academics behaving badly and refusing to obey the rules. So Timothy Leary very famously just left Harvard. He's like, you guys have too many rules and do what I want. It's like the Eric Cartman of the psychedelic world. and that didn't play too well either. And so it became an easy target as well. It's like, why are the youth refusing to go to Vietnam? It must be the drugs. And so in 1966, I think it is, I'm not super at history, California banned psychedelics, and the rest of the world was like, oh, California, that seems like a permissive place. They're not doing it. We better not do it either. And then global ban, essentially. And so this is just a histogram, like the bigger, the higher the line, the more studies are being published on psychedelics. And right when that California ban hits, you start seeing publications drop off because no one wants to take the professional risk of illegally administering these substances. And then we have this sort of quiet period, like 30 years. And then in the 2000s, well, maybe starting in the 1990s, but definitely in the 2000s, you start seeing MDMA trials, I think, were some of the first on the map, being approved again and being done above board legally with the proper approvals. And nowadays, we see this kind of balloon in research again. So you see this massive upswell, and it's actually, if depending on how you search for terms, it's even more of a staggering increase as approvals are starting to come out again to start understanding the potential of these drugs. And I think part of it is a growing dissatisfaction with the state of the world, and specifically with the state of pharmacotherapy, where we haven't really come up with another good drug for things like mood, for instance, for a long time. We've made antidepressants safer in the past 2 new generations of antidepressants, but the efficacy is not improved. So it's like there's a thing out here we knew maybe really worked for people or had potential, especially in these treatment-resistant cases that got banned, and what we have isn't helping these people by definition. It's treatment-resistant, so it may be worth the risk, as Anne was saying, and I think that's really been the thin edge of the wedge, whereas microdosing, I think, is trying to get a bit further down the path into maybe less acute distress, but still the potential to transform lives. So I think there's this new wave of research coming out of a few different sites around the world and a growing number of sites where when combined with the advent of new brain imaging technologies, for instance, we can really start to get an empirical, like evidence-based handle on what these drugs are doing that isn't just from self-report. So we can see, for instance, that psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, dramatically increases the connection between different parts of the brain. So you don't need to know anything about brains, just know that every dot there is like a little blip of brain. The more lines connecting it, the more parts of the brain are talking to each other. And so you can start to get these sort of evidence-based accounts of what these drugs are doing. And it just takes us to a really interesting point in time now where you think about, like, it seems like there's this wellspring of interest, both from the community, thanks for coming, and from researchers, and especially people in distress. And there's also a whole bunch of other stakeholders, including the private sector, who are doing their best, though maybe not that one in Ontario, to make a lot of money off the legalization of marijuana, and thinking, like, what's the next product that I'm going to make $1 billion off of?
Right.
And so there's both this sort of altruistic, like, maybe we can really help people situation that we're put in, but we're kind of at a crossroads where that's not really the motive of a corporation trying to license a drug.
Right.
And so who's going to actually control access and distribution and legalization, and who's even presenting evidence around safety and policy to policymakers? And that's kind of where we are right now. So it's a really interesting time to be doing this sort of work.
Cool. Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah.
So let's take a question from the audience, if we can. I see a hand over here.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. I have a question about where we are in the legalization in Canada, because I've noticed in the last few years you can get mushroom products like mushroom coffee. Is it Paul Stamets that does fungi.com, where you can get lion's mane? How are those products different and already legal, and where are we in terms of legalizing psilocybin and MDMA?
Okay, good question.
Do you want me to
Yeah, might as well
take
start.
us
I've been
out?
talking for a while.
Sure. So I'll start with the mushroom supplements you might be seeing around. So, for example, Paul Stamets, who is a very, if you've seen the film Fantastic Fungi that's been playing in different theaters, Paul's featured very heavily there. So what he sells and those different products like lion's mane, those are all legal. Those don't have any psychoactive properties to them. So if you're having your reishi mushrooms or your chaga mushrooms, like those are all just mushrooms, and those are fine. And then we are starting to see things popping up where people can purchase mushrooms with psychoactive properties. Those are not legal, and that I want to make that really clear. You can see them; they're starting to pop up in different places. None of the psychoactive drugs, they are drugs, but the ones with psychoactive properties are not legal in Canada. So what that means, so all the research we've been doing with psilocybin, with MDMA, it is all with special licenses and special exemptions to be working with what's considered a Schedule I drug, so one that is not legal for any purpose other than with special permission for research. So that means that's why it takes us so long to do these psychedelic studies, is we have to go through many, many layers of approvals and regulatory processes and ethics, which is good in some ways because we have this opportunity to create great evidence that is of the highest quality to demonstrate the usefulness of these tools, which is kind of ties into Norm's point that we're a little bit concerned about what will happen if it's in the hands of folks who are not necessarily with that intent in mind. And what that also means is that both psilocybin and MDMA have been given what's called breakthrough therapy status in the US. And that's by the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration. And breakthrough therapy status means that there's such strong evidence so far for their use that they're being expedited in the approvals process. And when we're talking about drug development, there are multiple phases. The final phase is what's called phase 3, and that's when you are seeing clinical trials that happen in multiple different locations, so different teams doing it, creating an efficacy and effectiveness database. Then that can be taken forward to be presented to say, hey, can we use this? And there'll be an approval for use as a prescription. So MDMA is in phase 3 trials right now. So if everything goes according to plan, it could well be legal to have MDMA prescribed for therapy by probably 2022 at
In
this
the
point.
States?
In the States. And we anticipate that it would follow quickly in Canada, because it generally does. If something's approved in the US, then it will quickly get approved here. Psilocybin is in phase 2 clinical trials, but they are going at a breakneck speed with those. So that also might be on a quick trajectory. We don't know at this point, but that's what we're thinking.
Another question from the audience? Yeah, I've got a hand just shot up there. Wherever you take that mic, I'll follow your lead.
Hello?
Hi.
I was about MDMA. When you were talking about how it benefited the whoever your patient or whatever, is it because they remember how they felt and what they covered during the therapy session? Like you were saying that it serves as a template. Like how exactly? Do they see the possibility that they can feel that way? Do you know what I mean? Like is it everything that they said that they wouldn't have said if they weren't under the influence of the drug? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Good question. That's a very good question. Yeah.
So when a treatment works for PTSD, we usually think of it as working in 2 ways. One is that we're no longer avoiding something, and avoidance is a hallmark of PTSD, meaning that we're avoidant of, it could be memories, it could be emotions, it could be experiences, it could be conversation. I often say, as many people as there are in the world, there are different ways that we avoid, and we all avoid in some way as human beings. But when you have PTSD, it's particular avoidance about the trauma or traumas that have happened. So that's step 1, is reducing avoidance. And then step 2 is meaning making. And so meaning making is this idea of having an understanding of why the trauma happened, how we make sense of it now, and unraveling how it's had impact in our lives. And that's usually ties in with ideas around trust and power and control and intimacy, esteem, all these components that make up this web that get really stuck together and make it really difficult to move past. And so when we're doing therapy or when we're using MDMA, and the MDMA can sometimes feel like a bit of a boost to that experience, it will, if we think of it like a knot like this, and in therapy we're often pulling different strings to try to get the knot to loosen, in an MDMA or a psychedelic session, it's like the knot goes like this in the session, and then afterwards you're kind of like, oh, okay, how do I make sense of all of that? But it's had a moment to loosen up. And so in that session, it could be that you're not avoiding memories anymore. It could be that you're not avoiding emotions. People have hard times in these sessions. They are not blissful at all. There can be moments of bliss, but it's difficult. People are going into the memories, experiences, strong emotions, and that's powerful because they're not avoiding it anymore. And then that's how people get well, is to move through that experience.
Oh, hang on. We need the microphone because otherwise it doesn't get broadcast through the web. That's okay. Just a quick follow-up question here.
Sorry. Is this why it's commonly used for suicide patients? And like I read that somewhere because it's like it's that way they can immediately get like trust with their therapist. Is that true?
So MDMA doesn't tend to be used with people who are acutely suicidal. It's people can become suicidal at any point in their journey with any mental health condition. However, what has been used when folks are acutely suicidal is ketamine. And ketamine is a different type of substance that's actually a dissociative. So it can take you out of the pain for a moment, and then you make sense of how to work with that when you're no longer in that state of intense pain. Ketamine has been receiving a lot of attention recently because it is not a Schedule I drug. Therefore, people can prescribe it in treatment. But my personal opinion is that I think we need to be cautious with the use of ketamine. There's enthusiasm behind it because it's like, okay, well, we can use it because we're able to prescribe it right now. It is indicated for certain things at certain times, and the effects are not necessarily long-lasting like other psychedelics are. So I think there is room for it and for its use, but I I think we need to bring caution to all of this work, and it in particular.
Yeah, and just to link it to something else that's non-drug, I think it's interesting, Norm, that this isn't the bulk of your research. Most of your questions are about mindfulness. I mean, you're more of a meditation person. So what's the link between meditation and these kinds of drugs? So how do those fit together in your research program?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm really interested in is mental habits, right? So I'm interested in what we learn about the world that we then learn so well that we can't even see we've learned it. It's just that's our way of knowing, right? And so I see them as, meditation, psychedelics, sometimes just travel, different types of experiences often can offer gateways into seeing things in a different perspective and help destabilize some of these mental habits. So I think that's really a bit of the connection. And actually, one point I wanted to sort of fold into this, building on Ann said, is I think there's actually a third explanation that we haven't really ruled out, which is this is like a bottom-up biological process. And so most of how psychedelics has been marketed is you're going to have these profound insights. You're never going to look back in the world the same way again. And it's because of this sort of meaning making or changes in like your basic orientation to experience that you're going to have some kind of benefit. But in the case of ketamine, for instance, that's not how it really broke into the mainstream. What happened is people were administering ketamine in clinical context, but it wasn't based on sort of like an insight kind of process. So those theories are now cropping up. In the 2000s, there's a bunch of these really high-profile neuroscience papers talking about neuroplasticity being potentiated. So you take this drug and all of a sudden your brain starts growing connections and talking to parts of the brain it might not before.
Yeah, so just, sorry to interrupt you, but neuroplasticity is the idea that your brain can do new things. So plasticity is the ability to do new stuff. And so these were papers that showed ketamine tapped into neuroplasticity, made people's brains do new stuff.
Yes, and so it wasn't really about having such an altered experience. So you could have really interesting mental work done when you are dissociated and not in contact with the pain or the suffering. And that might still be why some of these psychedelics work that we haven't ruled out. I think that's actually one of the benefits of doing a microdosing trial is you could build up the drug in someone's system without them having these acute perceptual distortions and see if you get the same return on investment. And if you do, it kind of blows up the inside story. But I suspect, of course, it's going to be a bit of both. That you would want to create a context in which your brain can change, and then you also have to provide an environmental, a social context where that change is directed in a constructive way. Right?
So it changes the right way.
Yeah, like if you have a bad habit where you get angry all the time when things don't go your way, and then you destabilize your brain, and then you learn to become fearful all the time, that's not really like, like, great, I swapped out one terrible thing for something else. So what we're trying to do is create access points where people can both first visualize what their habits are, experience directly what their habits are by having a little bit of distance, and then work with those habits and try to sort of pull out the weeds, it's sort of pernicious habits, the habits that are maladaptive or harmful, but then also create some sort of pathway towards growth. And I think part of the caution, not to put words in your mouth, but is if we were just sort of marketing these drugs and just banking on bottom-up effects that destabilize what the brain already knows, what we already know, and they're not also given a supportive sort of growth context, you can have a lot of long-term negative consequences when the next thing the person learns to do with their stress or their suffering or their fear could be not any better than what they've already learned. And you know that these people are vulnerable to falling into these pathways because they're the people who are stuck in a treatment-resistant sort of hole to begin with.
Right. Yeah, that's a really neat way. As you're speaking, I'm sort of imagining that you sort of have this badly built Lego house. And so the drugs help you sort of smash it and get the Lego pieces so you can rebuild. But then you have to have some kind of a context so it gets built into a better Lego house and not into some other crappy sort of flat, whatever bad Lego house you have. Just imagine a Lego house.
Yeah, I mean, even in the meditation literature, we're seeing this, that people can have dissociative disorders, derealization, depersonalization disorders crop up when they go into intense meditation that's not in a broader trajectory of developing like virtue or something like that. Yeah.
Does anyone want to throw a question out? Yeah, we got one here. Got a couple in this area. Go ahead. Where's the microphone going to land? Here it is. Great.
Hi. So I have a question about the downsides of MDMA in terms of sometimes there's a crash. You end up worse off than you started. And with psilocybin, the case of destabilization, in certain people. And just to address that in a holistic way, and then jump to what would be the highest manifestation for these outcomes if it was a global phenomenon and people were using it sustainably. What would be your vision?
Great, 2 questions there. I'll let you guys fight over who gets to.
There's 2 turns. You got it?
Sure. So the crash after MDMA that we often hear about has to do with because there's so much serotonin that's released in the brain, that means that afterwards there feels like a depletion of serotonin a few days later. So partially what's going on when people are taking MDMA outside of a therapeutic context is it's cut with other things. And so part of that effect is also due to that. It's a combination of the depletion of serotonin plus oftentimes it's a strong amphetamine effect that's happened or other things. So it's partially that. The other thing that when people are taking it in a therapeutic context, we're warning them that this might happen. We're also warning them that they could be having a whole host of different emotions that are likely going to come up before, during, after. So it doesn't take anyone by surprise, and we're also working with them therapeutically when they're feeling lower. And so it actually, anecdotally from the trials that I've worked on, it has not been an issue. We just use it in therapy and move along. With psilocybin, it tends to be more the case that if there's going to be quote unquote destabilization, it's actually, I think of it more of it's a challenging experience within the session itself, and then it resolves post-session, and then you make sense of what was challenging and how you go forward with that. There's not something that happens afterwards. It's more in the session, and then you work with it afterwards. It can be very scary or very dark or all these various things, but these are all emotions that are getting stirred up that then get worked with. So that was part 1. And then part 2 was this idea of, and then I'll toss it over to you, Norm, but my vision for what I'd like to see this work with, and actually where my work is going now, is we're starting with this idea of transdiagnostic implications, meaning that it's not for one thing, but rather it's for health and well-being. I was going to say wealth, but no, it's health and well-being, which I suppose is wealth in an internal sense, right? So this idea that we can go beyond diagnosis, but more on this idea of we all have healing and growth to do, and so that we could be using it beyond that. And functionally, what I would love to see happen with that in the future is that you could choose to have a psychedelic-assisted therapy session. I'm only going to talk about that. There's lots of other conversations about what it would look like beyond a therapeutic context, but I'm going to focus on the therapeutic, that people could choose to have those experiences. You could choose to have that in the setting with someone who is well-trained, who knows how to hold you and support you in that experience, and you could do that at intervals in time. And honestly, I wish I remember who said this, but it's a wonderful saying that once you get the message, hang up the phone. And this is very true with psychedelics, that when people are going back to the pot all the time and going well, it's just time for another experience, it's what is the learning that you're actually taking from that? And so I could see that being the case where maybe it's once a year that people are going to have a psychedelic session that's supported.
Do you find that your patients want to do it again?
No. They don't. And I say that emphatically because it's so hard.
Yeah.
It's hard work. Sometimes we hear people saying, I wish I could have maybe one more in 6 months, right? So that it's a top up, or it's I have another piece of work I want to do. Huh. And so it's really framed in this okay, I got to get in there in my psyche again. There's no interest in doing it.
It's interesting because, as Canada, of course, has legalized marijuana. And so we've all sort of seen this societal shift that's been happening for a while, and this is part of it. But one of the things that gets me as a scientist that likes evidence and likes to form opinions based on evidence is the fan club. Like, there's this thing about marijuana where there's like these people that are like, dude, it's just the best stuff no matter what. It can never harm you in any possible way. It is always healthy. It is always good for you. And one of the things I'm most excited about with marijuana being legalized is that the research is getting done now. So we can say, well, you're smoking something, so that's bad for your lungs, and what are the long-term effects of the chemicals? And one of the things they're finding is that marijuana has a very different effect on the developed brain compared to the developing brain. And so marijuana for teenagers turns out to have all kinds of dangers that we didn't know about. And for adults, it seems to be safer in some ways than we knew about. And so anyway, there's a lot going on there, and I want to just understand from you the cultural context of psychedelics. Like, is there a fan club for psychedelics? And how do you, okay, so what's that like for you? I mean, what are you hearing from them, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think this picks up nicely on the gentleman's question as well. Like, what would it mean for people to sort of embrace this wholeheartedly, or to become a national, a global phenomenon? And the jury's still out there. There's any transformative practice is going to develop its like fervent fan base, right? Like, I'll go to a mindfulness conference and someone will say, if everyone meditated, there would be no more war. Mm-hmm. Okay, because people who are like Buddhists never like commit atrocities against other outgroups, right?
Right,
or anything like that. And then same thing with psychedelics. Like, if we could just get everyone to do one big trip, then like all of our problems would fade away. And so of course this stuff is very Pollyanna-ish. But I think it's just like jumping into extreme thinking. But I think underneath that is a really deep, important philosophical question that's around like maturity and wisdom. And a question I would sort of ask like people in the audience, ask myself, is like, have we already figured out everything there is to know about developing a human being? Like, are we all there? Are we all like self-actualized? Are we all like super like perfected beings? Or are there more things we can learn how to do consistently that we would want to bake into future iterations of our culture? Mm-hmm. And so I think there's some, without just saying like it'll just fix everything magically, there could be an argument that if you have certain types of experiences, they afford further development beyond just like mathematics or like be able to think a bit abstractly, right? And so in some spiritual traditions, psychedelic traditions have tried to formalize what they think some of these stages are. But I would, just to give a bit of content to that, one of the main ideas here is this idea that if you realize that the way you see the world is somewhat arbitrary and constructed just based on like how you've been conditioned by your past experiences, but that who you are is not that conditioning, and therefore like yourself is not just your personal history. There's an argument that's been made cross-culturally for thousands of years that this will allow you to actually care about other people. And if you don't actually get over your own particular circumstances, you are never really going to be free to treat other people as having as much value as you do. Right? This idea that if you can believe that yourself is just somewhat arbitrary and that the world is the true state of the world is actually changing, and there is no objective reality that you could be losing track of. It's all been constructed and conditioned that you could be there for other people because you're actually not different from them.
So travel does that, right?
Yeah. So travel. That's why I was saying there's so many access points, and the idea is that if you give people access points that are safe. It's very hard to predict who's going to respond to any given access point. One person can go travel and be like, I see there's all these different ways of living in the world. I've been living in this one way. And someone else is just like, yeah, it was hot.
Right.
I was uncomfortable. I like being home, right? And the flip side could be like that person could have an incredible psychedelic trip and realize that they're part of one massive common humanity, and someone else is just like, it was really, the lights were kind of bright, and I don't know if I really liked it. It was intense, right? So it's more about culturally getting clear that like maybe there is more that we could develop to be happier, to take care of each other more. That's sort of, I think that's the less mystical and real appealing hook to it, and then it just becomes a big experiment, right? Like let's legalize, see what happens. Right. But what does seem to be clear is that without some sort of, I guess, oversight, or like there's no curator, even if it's in like a cultural sense of what these experiences are supposed to mean, it's going to mean all kinds of different things. You're not going to get one particular output. Everyone's going to sort of live into their own expectancy, and that might not be something pro-social or wise, right? It might be like, I wonder just how far I can break away from the mainstream, man, and then that's where you start feeding it to fears of like destabilization of society and things like that.
So that's interesting. So so I see a part of you that's very excited about the possibilities for this, but you sort of are saying that you've sort of thought through how far this could go, and it's not going to be a fit for everybody, and it's not going to be a cure for everything, but there's a lot of untapped potential here, and you think that things could get better. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, I mean, we can see it from the evidence that's there, right? Like, where are we allowed to use these drugs? And people where we've tried everything else that we're allowed to try, including shocking people to give them brain damage, like electroconvulsive therapy. The way ketamine started getting used for mood was because it was used as an analgesic. It was supposed to make it not hurt so bad when they gave you brain damage by shocking you in electroconvulsive therapy.
Are you serious?
And then they would be manipulating doses, and at the lowest doses of electroconvulsive therapy, they're getting this treatment response. And you're like, what? Is it the ketamine, not the electricity, that's doing this?
Wow.
So like, yeah, we don't really know. But the whole point here is like the reason why these drugs are coming into the mainstream now is because they seem to work where everything else we've tried has failed.
Right.
So it's another access point, and it could fail too for a given person, but it could succeed, and we should try to understand like for whom it has a chance to work.
Sure, and there's the cultural enthusiasm, but then you've alluded to this a little bit, both of you, about the fear that corporate greed is going to somehow ruin this. So what is the fear there? What do we have to watch for as things progress in the next 5, 10, 15 years? What are we watching for, Anne?
I think the thing that's popping up the most to me when you said that was this idea of grand claims about things. And so grand claims about world's first, about that this experience is going to change your life, that this is the way to actualize. We don't know. We don't know these things. And nothing is first, right? These things have been used for ages. Like, they have been used in indigenous and traditional cultures for many thousands of years. So, and also like claims to the market around this idea of ownership of a particular substance, or ownership of some aspect of that production process or healing process. That's really, that's scary in a lot of ways, I think, because the idea that we're working so hard to develop these medicines to be able to treat the folks who need the medicines, and that there's a strong possibility that could get taken away, or that we're at this point in time where we are so close to legalization of some of these medicines for certain conditions, and if we start not doing the science right, that opportunity will go away. I do think that's the case. I am very concerned about people pushing the bounds on this, and it's already so hard to go through all the hurdles to do the science right, and that if we're now seeing protocols getting submitted or people trying to do work that is not backed by science in the same way, or not as rigorous, then it's going to make it so much more difficult for us to actually do the work that we're already doing. So there's that, and I think too like also jumping the gun on things, for example, like offering services to folks when there's a lot of enthusiasm. I know people are doing this because they want people to be well, or they want profit, sometimes both. But it's also, it takes more than good intentions or a drive to do it, to be able to do this type of work well. And so I think that concerns me when I see folks starting to offer things when I don't know what their background is.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, so I've got some cue cards here. These are questions that some of you wrote down, and this one ties really nicely into that. The question is, do you think it's important for therapists to have lived experiences with these substances? Is that part of the training for people who do the kinds of work that you do?
So I can, MAPS, so the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, has been my funder for several of my studies. And so I was part of their original guinea pig cohort of people who went through the training. And I was very fortunate that I had the opportunity of taking part in a legal study for therapists to have their own MDMA therapy experience.
So you've walked the walk.
I've walked the walk. So I've actually got a placebo in one session, got MDMA in the other, did not know, and then I knew, and very clearly knew. And I would say, before that experience, I was completely agnostic around this idea of using psychedelics. I'd never used a psychedelic before. I was already a psychologist. I was a clinical trialist. That's my background. And I was like, okay, maybe this might be something, but I wasn't sure. And so for me, having that experience was very helpful in understanding what goes on. However, I think if we're able to offer it in those contexts, that's a very useful tool. I don't think, though, that everyone has to have had a psychedelic experience. I do think having some experience with different doorways, I like how that was described, or different pathways in, is that, perhaps if someone's had a very deep meditation experience, they may well have been in a non-ordinary state, or they've done a breathwork experience where they've moved into a non-ordinary state. So there's lots of other ways, there's other doorways in. It doesn't have to be consuming a psychedelic. So I do think understanding of that realm is very helpful, but there's different ways of getting there.
Let me ask you the question, Norm. I mean, take meditation. Can somebody really study meditation if they don't meditate?
It's really contentious, but most of the people who've been teaching meditation for a long time, I mean, of course, they'd be biased to say so, would say no. And it's a issue around what can actually be regulated as well, right? So to be like a yoga teacher or a meditation teacher, there's no college that's going to strip you of your shingle, like rip your shingle off the door or something if you're not doing it right. And the counter argument is, do you have to have been a cocaine addict to treat someone who has a cocaine dependency disorder? Like, hopefully not.
Right.
I think when Anne says really resonates with me too, you need to at least be in the ballpark of understanding the processes that you're trying to examine or engage in a therapeutic context, but you might not have to have done that particular drug or use that particular access point. But just practically speaking, the type of person who decides, like in general, like I'm going to go choose this to be the thing I focus on, tends to have had some sort of formative experience earlier that tends not to be legal, and they're just waiting in the woodwork to come out for a chance when they can do it. So this was true of meditation, where you had people who were like lifetime scientists who were like closet meditators. It's also true of a lot of the people we have meetings with. They're like, yeah, I never want to take the risk and do this, but I've been kind of waiting for it to be okay. And I think that's actually part of why things are moving so quickly now. Is we have this sort of like hidden infrastructure of people who are actually quite sympathetic to these drugs because they did something to them or something they know about someone they know that turned out to be beneficial, but they didn't decide to make that their personal crusade, but they're sympathetic to it. And if that wasn't the case, you wouldn't see things move as quickly as they are now.
Right. So this gets into like a nice muddy pool of issues that I have been thinking about ever since I knew we were going to have this conversation. And I talked to you about this on the phone too, right? Is the question of sort of what's the entry point for a young person who's curious about this stuff, right? And so classically, they are, a teenager is curious and they end up getting their hands on illegal stuff and they go that way. I'm always excited when scientists sort of show their true colors and show that scientists come from all kinds of backgrounds and all kinds of experiences, and that kid who had that experience can become a scientist. But I really also want to make sure we're clear that there are other pathways. If this is interesting to you as a young person, that's not the pathway you have to take to get there. So I kind of want to get into the conversations. I can't see the audience that well, and I'm not good at judging ages anyway, but let's say that there's somebody who's here with their 15-year-old kid, and they're listening to this talk. Let me just get out of the way that the Ontario Science Centre says in writing, their lawyers say in writing, this event does not promote recreational microdosing. In the spirit of great conversations, the experts will discuss the clinical findings intended for use by trained medical practitioners in controlled trials. So we've got that check marked. Okay, so you're the experts. So what do you say to that, mom and their teenager or dad and their teenager or family or whatever that are in the audience or watching on the web, what do you say to them about where it all starts for a teenager?
Yeah, well, we did chat about this a bit. My sense of what the drugs tend to be doing is destabilizing these sort of habit networks, right? So then it's a question of, and back to your point about but people who say like, oh, I could do no evil. If it's really that powerful, it's a tool. The tool's gonna do what the tool's gonna do. The hammer's gonna smash things. The drill's gonna turn and go penetrate things. Like, the psilocybin is gonna increase connections and things that you've learned to block out, and that's gonna come at the expense of stability. Right, of having things be the same. So what's the right time to start introducing a ton of change into a system? Well, when the system gets locked into a pathological or maladaptive state. So, I get in trouble for saying this, if you had a teenager who was clearly locked into that state and couldn't get out, it might not be the worst thing for them to do the drugs, but most teenagers, like normatively, are already in a highly destabilized state where what they're trying to do is prune out, like literally prune out, like in a gardening analogy, prune out all of their different options and figure out like a stable set of ways of relating to experience and behaving that are going to work for them in their lives. Mm-hmm. So do you want to add more chaos into that system at that point in time? When at a critical point in time when they're trying to figure out how to find some sense of stability, I think that's pretty risky. Like, might there be some cases where it's the right thing to do? Yeah, but in general, it's probably not the right time, right? Now, ironically, it's the time when most people are getting exposed to these drugs.
Right.
So, so then, and maybe. And can speak about this more, then the question is, if they're going to do it anyway, then how do you make sure that what happens when you destabilize is constructive, right? How do you create a context that's going to at least minimize harm if they're going to do it anyway? Like, would you rather your kid drink at home or in the parking lot, right? So, and people are going to have different opinions about that thing. But from just a pure like developmental trajectory way, like if you can wait till you're like 23, you're much less likely to do any sort of long-term brain damage than if you do it when you're 17. Huh. So maybe like you have a pact, like just stick to the soft stuff until, like you're like when you turn 23, then you can start shaking things up a little and you know who you are a little bit more and you have a bit more more experience to integrate these crazy, very different experiences into what you already know.
No, I like what you said because I think it's a good answer because it explains it in a context that makes biological sense. And what are your thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, my perspective is education, I think, point blank. And this idea that if adults are not scared about talking about this, about psychedelics, about their impacts with their kids, with their teens, and the emphasis is on setting in context, then that goes a long way. Because we all know prohibition doesn't work, right? If we say don't do something, what are they going to do? They're going to go do something. So this idea of actually creating a true understanding of what the impacts can be is really useful. And I think about in different cultures, oftentimes psychedelics are actually used as rites of passage. And it may be a psychedelic or maybe other forms of moving into non-ordinary states. And so if it can also be viewed as that, so it's framed more as a rite of passage, doesn't mean like there has to be a ceremony around it, but just even a conversation about that and the impacts it can have and the meaning that has, I think that's really important. And all the education about brain functioning and what can happen with that. So I'm of the perspective that we're not going to be stopping anyone. Like there's, teens are going to try things always. And so let's arm them with the best education and the least fear we can. So that there's not this idea of that they can't talk to folks about it. Because that's one thing actually I see in my clinical practice is people then come to me for integration after they've done something. And so I end up with a lot of folks in their early 20s who've been taking psychedelics and didn't take it in safe contexts and good settings, and then they're like, I don't know what happened, and it's really blown up my world, right? So that's the flip side of that, and because they don't have people they can talk to about it, and so then they're coming and working with us.
Right. Another great answer. And I will just offer, having thought about this a lot, that I hope if you've got a teenager and you're watching this with them or you're here with them, this is the beginning of a conversation. Different families have different rules, different expectations, and communication just can't hurt in this context. Because you're right, it feels weird to offer this advice because my whole life it's been no. That's what you say to kids. You say no, and that should take care of everything. And your acknowledgement that it doesn't take care of everything is helpful. I have more questions that I have more questions that were handed in cue cards, but I haven't gone to the audience in a little bit. We still have a good 15 minutes left before we're going to run out of time. So let's take this question here, and we'll go with that.
Regarding ketamine again, I've seen some papers using it as a rapid-acting antidepressant so that then the more traditional antidepressants can be used as they come in later. Are there any other psychedelic medications that are being explored as adjunct treatments to other medications?
You mean specifically for acute depression, like the risk of suicide?
Or any other mental health condition?
So my understanding is no. The reason being that we require that in our clinical trials with MDMA and psilocybin that people not be on any other medication. So they have to go off of their psychotropic meds. With classic psychedelics, the presence of an SSRI will actually...
What's that, sorry?
Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor will actually block the effect of the psychedelic. So you don't get...
That's ketamine. So if you take ketamine, it blocks the...
Sorry, no. If you take an SSRI like Prozac or Celexa or the range of various antidepressants that one could take, we'll use that blanket term, that because they're acting on similar systems, that you won't have a psychedelic effect from it. And it's actually very dangerous to take MDMA with any type of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So don't do that. And very clearly don't do that. So no. So we're not seeing this as an adjunctive piece with other medications. Short answer.
Yeah, I think the spirit of the question, though, is consonant with sort of a movement in research now, which is you might need certain things to shake people out of maybe not electroconvulsive therapy, but like to shake them out of where they're stuck, and then you can do a more long-term strategy, right? Even in just talk therapies, if you have someone who's really difficult to treat a depression, first thing you do is behavioral activation therapy, right? You just get them moving. Because what they know is like a cycle of all the reasons why they can't do anything. So you need to like introduce evidence that counters that, and then you can move on to the more cognitive therapy and things like that. There's transcranial magnetic stimulation, which has a lot of the same properties as ketamine. You get a pretty good response pretty quickly.
So that's like a giant magnet on your head?
It's actually just a little hair. It's more like a hair dryer, and you're like, and you just you're sort of perturbing the electrical fields in the brain. And it works a lot. It has a lot of the same efficacy profile as ketamine, where like about half of the people who don't respond to conventional treatment will respond to this, but then within a month or two, it'll slide back because you haven't actually.
It stops working after a month or two.
No, they're not going to keep getting it like multiple times a day, right? So you get your dose, and then the dose where you have your experience, and then it wears off, and then you fall back into your old ways. So in the short term, like in that month, that person probably is way more plastic, right? To use that term, like they can not in like a Barbie Ken kind of way, but like plastic, but they can change more, right? They can change more. They're more open to ideas. And then could you fit something in that's more like a long-term growth trajectory at that point? That's really exciting, right? And I think that's a frontier for science is trying to figure out like when is the right time to situate this, and even as you're saying it, it's like at a particular point in your therapy, it's a great time to do NDMA, and then there's a lot more work to be done afterwards, right? It's like a springboard, a stepping point.
So it's not just that you take it and there's a before and after. It's just part of a sequence of things that have to be sort of put in order. This is a question you probably get quite often. I'm sure there are lots of people who are saying, how do I become your next rat for your experiments? How do I get into these trials? Maybe people because they want the therapy, maybe because they're curious, maybe they think this would be interesting. Where do you find people, and where could people go if they were interested in participating in these kinds of studies?
Right, so right now we are not recruiting. However, if people are interested in the future, there are several sources of information where you can find out about when trials are starting. And so one is through MAPS, so maps.org. They have a list of trials that are active. The other is through Remedy. We do have a list for information about when we will be recruiting. And also, right now, there is no legal way of receiving psychedelics and treatment. I often get a lot of emails like wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and I'm like, no. This is only happening in these contexts of research right now. Yeah, those are the main things.
Yeah, I mean, the interest is definitely there. Like, we have a web form for the psychedelic program at U of T, and it gets used every day, multiple times a day.
Is it the same person? Just like,
No,
please.
It could be, and it says like right above the form, like we're not recruiting right now, but if you're interested, like if you just need somewhere to put your name down, put it down here.
Yeah.
But practically speaking, like it's your probability of getting legal psychedelics at this point in time is staggeringly low. Right? So if this is something you're passionate about, like this is not the right way to go about it. And I would like ... Right? Because like it's just how many people are going to get recruited into a trial compared to how many want to try these drugs?
Right.
Just proportions, right? Like go buy some lottery tickets. Like it's like that kind of thing, right? So we're talking about taking like one person at a time with like a lot of resources around them and watching them and maybe trying to build that up to like it would be glorious to get like 100 people and then counter that with like 10, 20 people trying to sign up every day when the sign at the top of the form says you can't sign up yet.
Right.
So yeah, you can make of that what you will, but there isn't really a legal way to do this yet. Maybe it's coming, like stay tuned.
So you both have a way people can show their interest, but you don't get your hopes up because there's just way more demand than we can possibly, there just aren't enough spots to be getting people. It's kind of like being an astronaut.
Yeah,
right? Like NASA has a call every year,
Yeah.
and people apply, but nobody's becoming an astronaut.
Exactly. It's good to have a
You ain't going to Mars.
Yeah, that you have maybe have a couple other coals in the fire than just
Right.
like getting signed up for a clinical trial
Sure.
if you really
Should
are
have
desperate
another
for some
career
change.
plan.
Yeah.
Okay, great. We have about 10 minutes left. I've got a few more questions myself, but I want to make sure I give you guys an option to be part of the conversation. Anyone with a question? Got a hand up down here. Can we bring the microphone down here? Thank you.
Just have two small ones. How long are these sessions with MDMA? Is it a whole day? Is it an hour?
It's a whole day.
It's a
So
whole day.
people would come into the clinic often around 9 a.m. We're getting them situated, doing different tests ahead of time. Then if they're taking the medicine somewhere between 10 and 11 a.m., then we're there with them until minimum 5 p.m. and often longer than that. And then they actually stay overnight in the facility.
Oh, that answered my second question. I was going to say, what is the reaction time of the drug after it is administered? So it would be a few hours, I guess.
Yeah, the acute effect is mostly out of the person's system within 5 to 6 hours. And
So it ramps up in about, how long does it take to before it starts?
Anywhere between 45 minutes, 40 minutes and an hour and 15 usually for folks.
Okay.
And then the kind of the peak of the experience is somewhere around 2 hours-ish, and it continues for a while after that. And then we only leave, like the therapists only leave when we're sure that people are stable enough to kind of settle down and not be in a therapeutic process anymore.
And they're not likely to come back for a year or so, or maybe after 6 months they will see whether they need another treatment.
So the way it's designed right now is they receive 2 MDMA sessions in my studies within a course of therapy. So they get 2 MDMA sessions 3 weeks apart, and that's it. So right now there is no mechanism for them to be able to come back for a booster. That was just a report that people might be interested, if it was available at some point, to be able to have a booster session in 6 months or a year, something like that.
I think a lot of people will want to know, Big Pharma, so are you guys getting offers? Are you getting funding from pharmaceutical companies? And how do you divulge that? And what do you do with that? You're saying just no.
No. No, because there are no patents available for a lot of these drugs, so big pharma companies aren't interested. However, there are companies that are running their own trials. I don't currently work with any of them, so that's, yep.
Yeah, we've been approached by all sorts of people. We've mostly only worked with people willing to donate, which means that there's no strings attached. You sign a donation agreement, you say what the spirit of the donation is, and then you trust the researchers to try to execute that to the best of their ability, but there's no liability or consequence, and there's nothing you have to return back to the donors.
Would there ever be, you can't publish results of a certain kind?
Not in a proper donation agreement. We have been approached by venture capitalists and some other companies who are quite interested in figuring out how they can make money off these drugs. And actually, I have no personal problem with someone making money off of running trials and then using that to help with their marketing, right? That's fine with me. But what has always broken down these agreements is they want to own the safety data.
Yeah.
So they want to own the safety data. What does that mean?
It means that if they decide later on that you can publish safety data, then okay, but they could say no and you have no power.
I see.
And so that's been a deal breaker for us. Like in Canada and Ontario, universities are publicly funded. Our job is to serve the public. So if we can find a way to work with someone else that also helps them in their commercial partnership, great, but it can't come at the expense of our duty to the public. Mm-hmm. And controlling safety data by someone who has a vested interest in showing that the drugs are safe so they can make money off it because of their investment seems like a major conflict of interest.
Right.
And that's, I would say, 80% of the negotiations we've got into fall apart when we get to the point of like who owns the data, and it's not like we're saying like you can have a copy, we can have a copy, like only we get the copy, and then maybe if everything turns out to be good for us, then you can release this data. And I think if we're going to do research properly, it has to be even-handed, right? So we can talk about all the benefits, and it works in the situations other things don't, but then also for X number of people it didn't work, at least saying how many people it didn't work for, let alone more serious adverse events. Otherwise, I believe that information will never. How many people know what percentage of people antidepressants actually work for? There's no.
What percentage of people
they get Prozac? What are your chances it's going to work?
Okay, what are the odds that antidepressants will work? If you want to shout out a guess, I'll repeat it.
It varies based on condition. I know most commonly with depression, it's roughly 20%, and then roughly 20% for CBT.
20%. Any other guesses? Any other guesses? 5%? What's the real number?
I don't know.
Oh, you don't know? I was setting that up.
I mean, I shouldn't say that. I say this facetiously. We know better now because they've been on the market for a long time.
Okay.
When antidepressants came out, it was like the efficacy data was like an order of magnitude higher than these guesses, right? It's like, yeah, It's going to work on 50% or more people, and it's going to keep working. But that's because all of the data came from people who had these conflicts of interest. And so I'm afraid of that same pattern playing out now, because why would it be different than any other drug once it gets in the hands of people who that's the way they do business, right?
Right.
Yeah.
That's money can often get in the way of things. Money can be great, but sometimes it can give people different ulterior motives. Questions? There's some more questions that have sprung up on this side. We'll figure out how to get a microphone there. There we go.
Thank you so much for doing this. I'd be really interested in these sessions when people are having, somewhat subjective experience, how you actually are measuring the efficacy, someone before, during, after, and then on a more longitudinal basis as well, too.
Yeah, so how do you measure efficacy?
Yeah, so our designs for the PTSD studies are powered on outcomes related to PTSD. We're also measuring lots of other things, including relationship satisfaction, partner functioning in terms of their own depression, anxiety, et cetera. But the main outcome that we're looking at is what's happening to the PTSD symptoms. And so that's done in multiple ways, including kind of the gold standard way of doing that is using an independent rater, so that someone who is not one of the therapists, who's not involved in the study design, who is trained, who does the assessments with folks. So they're done at pre-treatment, they're done at post-treatment, and they're done at 2 points of follow-up. And then there's also self-report done by the person with PTSD and their partner about their PTSD symptoms. And that's done throughout the study, both at assessment time points and every session. So you actually get a ton of data showing what's happening with those symptoms over time.
I want to ask more questions, but I'm afraid we're just about out of time, and because I'm the moderator, I get to ask one more question. That's the whole reason I signed up for this, was for this privilege, so I'm just going to milk it. What's next for you? Like, you've got these data. What is the next thing that you're excited about in your research? And then, Norm, I'm going to ask you the same question right after. And what's coming?
Yeah, I've got a number of things that are really exciting. So one is doing this first MDMA study in Toronto. So that will be the first MDMA study in Toronto. The first time we're going to have a study that's sponsored by an agency in Canada. So Remedy is going to be the sponsor of it. So that's very exciting. And then a number of different studies, including the collaboration with Johns Hopkins on the psilocybin for PTSD work, as well as this idea of transdiagnostic work. So trying to bring it beyond diagnosis into basically into clinical distress more generally. And that would be both with MDMA and with psilocybin, but then also with couples and in groups. And so I think being able to take it out of this model where it's actually going to be really hard to access if it's just one person and two therapists, or two people and two therapists, the idea that we could bring it out to potentially other ways of delivering it, which would be really neat. So that's what I'm excited about next.
Great. Norm?
Yeah, well, we're still trying to get this microdosing trial up and running, moving through Health Canada approvals and ethics approvals at clinical sites. So getting the trial started would be nice. But I think we're trying to with this first trial, we're trying to up to something bigger than that, which is to set like a precedent for best practices for how someone at a university, like a publicly funded setting, can engage in this sort of research. So we're like deeply embedded in this sort of open science framework where you pre-register hypotheses. You have to do what you pre-registered because it's like publicly posted what you said you're going to do. That data is shared, is anonymized, of course, to protect confidentiality, but is shared and made publicly accessible so people can do their own analyses if they don't believe in your conclusions. So I was really excited about trying to set a template that's like not the big pharma template for drug discovery and for learning more about drugs. That's really, like, regardless of whether the study succeeds or fails in terms of like showing an improvement in mood, for instance, or that it's safe to drive, it would be nice to know that stuff, but also just show like, this is how it's viable to do this as a researcher. You don't need to gift a center $1 million or $2 million so that they can help you through a few of their approvals that they would use to block people at a university, which has been a bit of my experience so far,
Wow.
that the money opens doors. But if we can show the way to do it without paying off the people, the watchdogs, and then make that accessible to other people, that's really going to democratize this process. So that's really what I'd be excited about.
So it's not just what you might find about these specific drugs, it's how the process might be improved for the future.
Yeah, you shouldn't trust any study, right? Like even if any one study, if we run a perfect study with 100 people and find out that the drugs are safe, that's not enough to say that it's going to be safe for millions of people. Like just statistically, it's not. The only way to make this work, and I think Anna already talked about this when you get to larger scale clinical trials, is to have a consistent protocol that's tried in a bunch of different environments so you can see how robust these results really are. And the only way to make that happen in a way that's not heavily biased is to give access to other researchers the tools they need to get into this sphere. And right now it's all like no one knows, right? So it would be great to sort of document this journey and make it open the doors to other people who also want to get into this field of research.
Cool. Okay, well, we're out of time, unfortunately, but I definitely want to thank Ann Wagner and Norman Farb for just an excellent conversation. So thank you both. I knew it was a great topic right away, as did you. Thank you for coming. And thank you for being part of the conversation as well. I think that really moved things forward. But I got to say, you are both very, very good thinkers, and you're very articulate. And I learned a lot when I phoned you beforehand and asked you a bunch of questions, and I learned just as much again on stage with you now. It wasn't just you repeating the same information to me. It was really a great conversation. I really got a lot out of it. So I hope you did as well. Before we leave here, though, Andrea and Jasmine from the Ontario Science Centre Science School are going to spring up on this stage and say something. Here they are.
Hello, I'm Andrea.
And I'm Jasmine.
As Dan mentioned, we are students of the semester 76 at the Ontario Science Centre Science School.
Now, who here has even heard of the science school? A few? Okay. Cool.
Okay, so it's an amazing opportunity for a select amount of high school students that are interested in the science field.
Yeah, or even those who are just curious spirits.
You get to learn a lot here.
And plus, with class sizes of less than 30, you get to have really great bonds with your teachers and your classmates.
So for those interested, registration ends April 7th.
Yeah, so make sure you let future scientists know.
Okay. And finally, we would like to thank our panelists and our moderator for putting together this amazing event.
Yes, thank you so much for taking the time to teach us about the usages of psychedelics.
And we hope all of you have enjoyed this great conversation as much as we did. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys. That was great. Okay, thank you very much.